Chapter 9. Continence. Is it practicable or desirable? Thousands of well-intentioned people who agree that there are times and conditions under which it is a woman's highest duty to avoid having children advocate continence as the one permissible means of birth control. Few of these people agree with one another, however, as to what continence is. Some have in mind absolute continence. Others urge continence for periods varying from a few weeks to many years. Still others are thinking of keresa, or male continence, as it is sometimes called. The majority of physicians and sex psychologists hold that the practice of absolute continence is, for the greater part of the human race, an absurdity. Were such continence to be practiced, there is no doubt that it would be a most effective check upon the birth rate. It is seldom practiced, however, and when adhered to under compulsion, the usual result is injury to the nervous system and to the general health. Among healthy persons, this method is practicable only with those who have a degree of mentally controlled development, as yet neither often experienced nor even imagined by the mass of humanity. Absolute continence was the ideal of the early Christian church for all of its communicants, as shall be seen in another chapter. We shall also see how the church abandoned this standard and now confines the doctrine of celibacy to the unmarried, to the priesthood and the nuns. Celibacy has been practiced in all ages by a few artists, propagandists, and revolutionists in order that their minds may be single to the work which has claimed their lives and all the forces of their beings may be bent in one direction. Sometimes, too, such persons have remained celibate to avoid the burden of caring for a family. The Reverend Dr. Thomas Robert Malthus, who in 1798 issued the first of those works which exemplified what is called the Malthusian doctrine, also advocated celibacy or absolute continence until middle age. Malthus propounded the now widely recognized principle that population tends to increase faster than the food supply, and that unlimited reproduction brings poverty and many other evils upon a nation. His theological training naturally inclined him to favor continence, not so much from its practicability, perhaps, as because he believed that it was the only possible method. We would be ignoring a vital truth if we failed to recognize the fact that there are individuals who, through absorption in religious zeal, consecration to a cause, or devotion to creative work, are able to live for years or for a lifetime a celibate existence. It is doubtless true that the number of those who are thus able to transmute their sex forces into other creative forms is increasing. It is not with these, however, that we are concerned. Rather, it is with the mass of humanity who practice continence under some sort of compulsion. What is the result of forcing continence upon those who are not fitted or do not desire to practice it? The majority opinion of medical science and the evidence of statistics are united on this point. Enforced continence is injurious, often highly so. Physiology, writes Dr. J. Rutgers in Rassenverbesserung, teaches that every function gains in power and efficiency through a certain degree of control, but that the too extended suppression of a desire gives rise to pathological disturbances and in time cripples the function. Especially in the case of women, may the damage entailed by too long continued sexual abstinence bring about deep disturbances. All this, be it understood, refers to persons of mature age. For young men and women under certain ages, statistics and the preponderance of medical opinion agree that continence is highly advisable, in many cases seemingly altogether necessary to future happiness. The famous Dr. Bertillon of France, inventor of the Bertillon system of measurements for the human body, has made perhaps the most exhaustive of all studies in this direction. He demonstrates a large mortality for the boy who marries before his 20th year. When single, the mortality of French youths average only 14 per thousand. Among married youths, it rises to 100 per thousand, which shows that it is 6 or 8 times more perilous for a youth to be incontinent than continent up to that age. Dr. Bertillon's conclusions are that men should marry between their 25th and 30th years, and that women should marry when they have passed 20. With the single exception of young men and women below the ages noted, Dr. Bertillon's statistics tell a very different story, and where it relates to celibates, it is a shocking one. Dr. Bertillon shows that in France, Belgium, and Holland, married men live considerably longer than single ones, writes Dr. Charles L. Drysdale in summing up the matter in the population question, and are much less subject to becoming insane, criminal, or vicious. From the same studies we learn that the conjugal state is also more favorable to the health of the woman over nearly 20 years of age in the 3 countries covered. An analysis of criminal records showed that more than twice as many unmarried men and women had been held for crimes of all kinds than married persons. Rates based upon 10,000 cases of insanity among men and women in the same countries showed 3.95 per thousand for male celibates against 2.17 for married men. For single women, the rate was 3.4 against but 1.9 for married women. Insanity was reduced one half among women by marriage. More startling still is the evidence of the mortality statistics. Bertillon found that the death rates of bachelors and widowers averaged from nearly 2 to nearly 3 times as high as those of married men of the same ages. Dr. Mayer, in his Rapport Conjugaux, showed that the death rates among the celibate religious orders studied were nearly twice as high as those of the laity. Can anyone knowing the facts ask that we recommend continence as a birth control measure? Virtually all of the dangers to health involved in absolute continence are involved also in the practice of continence broken only when it is desired to bring a child into the world. In the opinion of some medical authorities, it is even worse, because the almost constant excitation of unsatisfied sex desire by the presence of the mate. People who think that they believe in this sort of family limitation have much to say about self-control. Usually they will admit that to abstain from all but a single act of sexual intercourse each year is an indication of high powers of self-restraint. Yet that one act performed only once a year might be sufficient to keep a woman with one child in her womb and another at her breast, during her entire childbearing period. That would mean from 18 to 24 children for each mother, provided she survived so many births and lactations. Contraceptives are quite as necessary to these self-controlled ones who do not desire children every year as to those who lead normal, happy love lives. From the necessity of contraceptives and from the dangers of this limited continence, certain persons are, of course, relieved. They are the ones whose mental and spiritual development is so high as to make this practice natural to them. These individuals are so exceedingly rare, however, that they need not be discussed here. Moreover, they are capable of solving their own problems. Few who advocate the doctrine of absolute continence live up to it strictly. I met one woman who assured me that she had observed it faithfully in the 13 years since her youngest child was born. She had such a loathing for sexual union, however, that it was doubtless the easiest and best thing for her to do. Loathing, disgust, or indifference to the sex relationship nearly always lies behind the advocacy to continence, except for the conscious purpose of creating children. In other words, while 1 in 10,000 persons may find full play for a diverted and transmuted sex force in other creative functions, the rest avoid the sex union from repression. These are two widely different situations. One may make for racial progress and the happiness of the few individuals capable of it. The other poisons the race at its fountain and brings nothing but the discontent, unhappiness, and misery which follow in forced continence. For all that, an increasing number of persons, mostly women, are advocating continence within marriage. Sexual union is nearly always spoken of by such persons as something in itself repugnant, disgusting, low, and lustful. Consciously or unconsciously, they look upon it as a hardship to be endured only, to bring God's image and likeness into the world. Their very attitude precludes any great probability that their progeny will possess an abundance of such qualities. Much of the responsibility for this feeling upon the part of many thousands of women must be laid to 2,000 years of Christian teaching that all sex expression is unclean. Part of it, too, must be laid to the dominant male's habit of violating the love rights of his mate. The habit referred to grows out of the assumed and legalized right of the husband to have sexual satisfaction at any time he desires, regardless of the woman's repugnance for it. The law of the state upholds him in this regard. A husband need not support his wife if she refuses to comply with his sexual demands. Of the two groups of women who regard physical union either with disgust and loathing or with indifference, the former are the less numerous. Nevertheless, there are thousands of them. I have listened to their stories often, both as a nurse in obstetrical cases and as a propagandist for birth control. An almost universal cause of their attitude is the sad lack of understanding of the great beauties of the normal, idealistic love act. Neither do they understand the uplifting power of such unions for both men and women. Ignorance of life, ignorance of all but the sheer reproductive function of mating, and especially a wrong training, are largely responsible for this tragic state of affairs. When this ignorance extends to the man in such a degree as to permit him to have the all too frequent coarse and brutal attitude towards sex matters, the tragedy is only deepened. Truly, the Church and those moralists who have been insisting upon keeping sex matters in the dark have a huge list of concealed crimes to answer for. The right kind of a book, a series of clear, scientific lectures, or common sense talk with either the man or woman will often do away with most of the repugnance to physical union. When the repugnance is gone, the way is open to that upliftment through sex idealism, which is the birthright of all women and men. When I have had the confidence of women indifferent to physical union, I have found the fault usually lay with the husband. His idea of marriage is too often that of providing a home for a female who would in turn provide for his physical needs, including sexual satisfaction. Such a husband usually excludes such satisfaction from the category of the wife needs, physical or spiritual. This man is not concerned with his wife's sex urge, save as it responds to his own at times of his choosing. Man's code has taught woman to be quite ashamed of such desires. Usually she speaks of indifference without regret, often proudly. She seems to regard herself as more chaste and highly endowed in purity than other women who confess to feeling physical attraction towards their husbands. She also secretly considers herself far superior to the husband who makes no concealment of his desire towards her. Nevertheless, because of this desire upon the husband's part, she goes on pretending to mutual interest in the relationship. Only the truth, plainly spoken, can help these people. The woman is condemned to physical, mental, and spiritual misery by the ignorance which society has fixed upon her. She has her choice between an enforced continence, with its health-wrecking consequences and its constant aggravation of domestic discord, and the sort of prostitution legalized by the marriage ceremony. The man may choose between enforced continence and its effects, or he may resort to an unmarried relationship or to prostitution. Neither of these people, the one schooled directly or indirectly by the church, and the other trained in the sex ethics of the gutter, can hope to lift the other to the regenerating influence of a pure, clean, happy love life. As long as we leave sex education to the gutter and houses of prostitution, we shall have millions of just such miserable marriage failures. Such continence as is involved in dependence upon the so-called safe period for family limitation will harm no one. The difficulty here is that the method is not practical. It simply does not work. The woman who employs this method finds herself in the same predicament as the one who believes that she is not in danger of pregnancy when she does not respond passionately to her husband. That this woman is more likely to conceive than the emotional one is a well-known fact. The woman who refuses to use contraceptives, but who rejects sex expression, except for a few days in the month, is likely to learn too soon the fallacy of her theory as a birth control method. For a long time, the safe period was suggested by physicians. It was also the one method of birth control countenanced by the ecclesiastics. Women are learning from experience, and specialists are discovering by investigation that the safe period is anything but safe for all women. Some women are never free from the possibility of conception from puberty to menopause. Others seemingly have safe periods for a time, only to become pregnant when they have begun to feel secure in their theory. Here again, continence must give way, as a method of birth control, to contraceptives. In the same category as the safe period, as a method of birth control, must be placed so-called male continence. The same practice is also variously known as karezza, sedular absorption, and zugassence discovery. Those who regard it as a method of family limitation are likely to find themselves disappointed. As a form of continence, however, if it can be called continence, it is asserted to bring none of the long course of evils which too often follow the practice of lifelong abstinence, or abstinence broken only when a child is desired. Its devotees testify that they avoid ill effects and achieve the highest possible results. These results are due probably to two factors. First, those who practice karezza are usually of a high mental and spiritual development, and are, therefore, capable of an exalted degree of self-control without actual repression. Second, they have the benefit of that magnetic interchange between man and woman which makes for physical, mental, and spiritual well-being. This stimulation becomes destructive irritation in ordinary forms of continence. The Oneida community, a religious group comprising about 130 men and 150 women, which occupied a part of an old Indian reservation in the state of New York, were the chief exponents of male continence. The practice was a religious requirement with them, and they laid great stress upon three different functions which they attributed to the sexual organs. They held that these functions were urinary, reproductive, and amative, each separate and distinct in its use from the others. Cases are cited in which both men and women are said to have preserved their youth and their sexual powers to a ripe old age, and to have prolonged their honeymoons throughout married life. The theory, however, interesting as it may be when considered as continence, is not to be relied upon as a method of birth control. Summing it all up, then, continence may meet the needs of a few natures, but it does not meet the needs of the masses. To enforce continence upon those whose natures do not demand it is an injustice, the cruelty and the danger of which has been underestimated rather than exaggerated. It matters not whether this wrong is committed by the Church through some outworn dogma, by the state through the laws prohibiting contraceptives, or by society through the conditions which prevent marriage when young men and women reach an age at which they have the need of to be married. The world has been governed too long by repression. The more fundamental the force that is repressed, the more destructive its action. The disastrous effects of repressing the sex force are written plainly in the health rates, the mortality statistics, the records of crime, and the entry of books in the hospitals for the insane. Yet this is not all the tale, for there are still the little understood hosts of sexually abnormal people and the monotonous misery of millions who do not die early nor end violently, but who are nevertheless devoid of the joys of a natural love life. As a means of birth control, continence is as impracticable for most people as it is undesirable. Celibate women doubtless have their place in the regeneration of the world, but it is not they, after all, who will, through experience and understanding, recreate it. It is mainly through fullness of expression and experience in life that the mass of women, having attained freedom, will accomplish this unparalleled task. The need of women's lives is not repression, but the greatest possible expression and fulfillment of their desires upon the highest possible plane. They cannot reach higher planes through ignorance and compulsion. They can attain them only through knowledge and the cultivation of a higher, happier attitude toward sex. Sex life must be stripped of its fear. This is one of the great functions of contraceptives. That which is enshrouded in fear becomes morbid. That which is morbid cannot be really beautiful. A true understanding of every phase of the love life, and such an understanding alone, can reveal it in its purity and in its power of upliftment. Force and fear have failed from the beginnings of time. Their fruits are wrecks and wretchedness. Knowledge and freedom to choose or reject the sexual embrace, according as it is lovely or unlovely, and these alone can solve the problem. These alone make possible between man and woman that indissoluble tie and mutual passion and a common understanding, in which lies the hope of a higher race. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10. Contraceptives or Abortion. Society has not yet learned the significance of the age-long effort of the feminine spirit to free itself of the burden of excessive childbearing. It has been singularly blind to the real forces underlying the cause of infanticide, child abandonment, and abortion. It has permitted the highest and most powerful thing in a woman's nature to be hindered, diverted, repressed, and confused. Society has permitted this inner urge of woman to be rendered violent by repression until it has expressed itself in cruel forms of family limitation, which this same society has promptly labeled crimes and sought to punish. It has gone on blindly forcing women into these crimes, deaf alike to their entreaties and to the lessons of history. As we have seen in the second chapter of this book, child abandonment and infanticide are by no means obsolete practices. As for abortion, it has not decreased but increased with the advance of civilization. The reader will recall that one authority says there are 1 million abortions in the United States every year, while another estimates double that number. Most of the women of the middle and upper classes in America seem secure in their knowledge of contraceptives as a means of birth control. Under present conditions, when the laws in most states regard this knowledge, however it be imparted, as illicit, and the federal statutes prohibit the sending of it through the mails, even the women in more fortunate circumstances sometimes have difficulty in getting scientific information. Nevertheless, so strong is their purpose that they do obtain it and use it correctly or incorrectly. The great majority of women, however, belong to the working class. Nearly all of these women will fall into one of two general groups: the ones who are having children against their wills, and those who, to escape this evil, find refuge in abortion. Being given their choice by society, to continue to be overburdened mothers, or to submit to a humiliating, repulsive, painful, and too often gravely dangerous operation, those women in whom the feminine urge to freedom is strongest choose the abortionist. One group goes on bringing children to birth, hoping that they will be born dead or die. The women of the other group strive consciously by drastic means to protect themselves and the children already born. Our examinations, says Dr. Max Hirsch, an authority on the subject, have informed us that the largest number of abortions in the United States are performed on married women. This fact brings us to the conclusion that contraceptive measures among the upper classes and the practice of abortion among the lower class are the real means employed to regulate the number of offspring. Thus a high percentage of women in comfortable circumstances escape overbreeding by the use of contraceptives. A similarly high percentage of women not in comfortable circumstances are forced to submit to forced maternity, because their only alternative at present is abortion. When accidental conception takes place, some women of both classes resort to abortion if they can obtain the services of an abortionist. When society holds up its hands in horror at the crime of abortion, it forgets at whose door the first and principal responsibility for this practice rests. Does anyone imagine that a woman would submit to abortion if not denied the knowledge of scientific, effective contraceptives? Does anyone believe that physicians and midwives who perform abortions go from door to door soliciting patronage? The abortionist could not continue his practice for 24 hours if it were not for the fact that women come desperately begging for such operations. He could not stay out of jail a day if women did not so generally approve of his services as to hold his identity an open but seldom betrayed secret. The question then is not whether family limitation should be practiced. It is being practiced. It has been practiced for ages, and it will always be practiced. The question that society must answer is this: shall family limitation be achieved through birth control or abortion? Shall normal, safe, effective contraceptives be employed, or shall we continue to force women to the abnormal, often dangerous surgical operation? The question, too, the church, the state, and the moralists must answer. The knowledge of contraceptive methods may yet for a long time be denied to the women of the working class, but those who are responsible for denying it to her, and she herself, to understand the more clearly the differences between birth control by contraceptives and family limitation through abortion, it is necessary to know something of the processes of conception. Knowledge of these processes will also enable us to comprehend more thoroughly the dangers to which woman is exposed by our antiquated laws, and how much better it would be for her to employ such preventive measures as would keep her out of the hands of the abortionist, into which the laws now drive her. In every woman's ovaries are embedded millions of ovules, or eggs. They are in every female at birth, and as the girl develops into womanhood, these ovules develop also. At a certain age, varying slightly with the individual, the ripest ovule leaves the nest or ovary and comes down one of the tubes connecting with the womb and passes out of the body. When this takes place, it is said that the girl is at the age of puberty. When it reaches the womb, the ovule is ready for the process of conception, that is, fertilization by the male sperm. At the time the ovule is ripening, the womb is preparing to receive it. This preparation consists of a reinforced blood supply brought to the lining. If fertilization takes place, the fertilized ovule, or ovum, will cling to the lining of the womb and there gather its nourishment. If fertilization does not take place, the ovum passes out of the body and the uterus throws off its surplus blood supply. This is called the menstrual period. It occurs about once a month or every 28 days. In the male organs there are glands called testes. They secrete a fluid called the semen. In the semen is the life-giving principle called the sperm. When intercourse takes place, if no preventive is employed, the semen is deposited in the woman's vagina. The ovule is not in the vagina, but it is in the womb, farther up, or perhaps in the tube on its way to the womb. As steel is attracted to the magnet, the sperm of the male starts on its way to seek the ovum. Several of these sperm cells start, but only one enters the ovum and is absorbed into it. This process is called fertilization, conception, or impregnation. If no children are desired, the meeting of the male sperm and the ovum must be prevented. When scientific means are employed to prevent this meeting, one is said to practice birth control. The means used is known as a contraceptive. If, however, a contraceptive is not used and the sperm meets the ovule and development begins, any attempt at removing it or stopping its further growth is called abortion. There is no doubt that women are apt to look upon abortion as of little consequence and to treat it accordingly. An abortion is as important a matter as a confinement and requires as much attention as the birth of a child at its full term. The immediate dangers of abortion, says Dr. J. Clifton Edgar in his book, The Practice of Obstetrics, are hemorrhage, retention of an adherent placenta, sepsis, tetanus, perforation of the uterus. They also cause sterility, anemia, malignant diseases, displacements, neuroses, and endometritis. In plain, everyday language, in an abortion there is always a very serious risk to the health and often to the life of the patient. It is only the women of wealth who can afford the best medical skill, care, and treatment, both at the time of the operation and afterwards. In this way they escape the usual serious consequences. The women whose incomes are limited and who must continue at work before they have recovered from the effects of an abortion are the great army of sufferers. It is among such that the deaths due to abortion usually ensue. It is these two who are most often forced to resort to such operations. If death does not result, the woman who has undergone an abortion is not altogether safe from harm. The womb may not return to its natural size, but remain large and heavy, tending to fall away from its natural position. Abortion often leaves the uterus in a condition to conceive easily again, and unless prevention is strictly followed, another pregnancy will surely occur. Frequent abortion tends to cause barrenness and serious painful pelvic ailments. These and other conditions arising from such operations are very likely to ruin a woman's general health. While there are cases where even the law recognizes an abortion as justifiable if recommended by a physician, I assert that the hundreds of thousands of abortions performed in America each year are a disgrace to civilization. The effects of such operations upon a woman, serious as they may be, are nothing as compared to the injury done her general health by drugs taken to produce the same result. Even such drugs as are prescribed by physicians have harmful effects, and nostrums recommended by druggists are often worse still. Even more drastic may be the effect upon the unborn child, for many women fill their systems with poisonous drugs during the first weeks of their pregnancy, only to decide at last, when drugs have failed, as they usually do, to bring the child to birth. There are no statistics, of course, by which one may compute the amount of suffering to mother and child from the use of such drugs, but we know that the total of physical weakness and disease must be astounding. We know that the woman's own system feels the strain of these drugs, and that the embryo is usually poisoned by them. The child is likely to be born rickety, have heart trouble, kidney disorder, or to be generally weak in its powers of resistance. If it does not die before it reaches its first year, it is probable that it will have to struggle against some of these weaknesses until its adolescent period. It needs no assertion of mine to call attention to the grim fact that the laws prohibiting the imparting of information concerning the preventing of conception are responsible for tens of thousands of deaths each year in this country and an untold amount of sickness and sorrow. The suffering and the death of these women is squarely upon the heads of the lawmakers and the puritanical, masculine-minded person who insists upon retaining the abominable legal restrictions. Try as they will, they cannot escape the truth, nor hide it under the cloak of stupid hypocrisy. If the laws against imparting knowledge of scientific birth control were repealed, nearly all of the 1 million or 2 million women who undergo abortions in the United States each year would escape the agony of the surgeon's instruments and the long trail of disease, suffering, and death which so often follows. He who would combat abortion, says Dr. Hirsch, and at the same time combat contraceptive measures may be likened to the person who would fight contagious diseases and forbid disinfection, for contraceptive measures are important weapons in the fight against abortion. America has a law since 1873 which prohibits by criminal statute the distribution and regulation of contraceptive measures. It follows, therefore, that America stands at the head of all nations in the huge number of abortions. There is the case in a nutshell. Family limitation will always be practiced as it is now being practiced, either by birth control or by abortion. We know that. The one means health and happiness, a stronger, better race. The other means disease, suffering, and death. The woman who goes to the abortionist table is not a criminal but a martyr to the bitter, unthinkable conditions brought about by the blindness of society at large. These conditions give her the choice between the surgeon's instruments and the sacrificing of what is highest and holiest in her, her aspiration to freedom, her desire to protect the children already hers. These conditions, not the woman, outface society with this question: contraceptives or abortion, which shall it be? End of chapter 10. Chapter 11. Are preventive means certain? There are several means of preventing conception which are both certain and harmless. What those means are, the state laws forbid me to say. If I should defy the state laws and name those contraceptives, the federal laws would forbid this book's going through the mails. Nor can I, without coming into conflict with the laws, tell why these means are reliable. It is difficult to discuss the subject without using franker language than the statutes permit, and I do not wish to violate the law in this particular book. Can I rely upon this? Is it certain? Will it prevent absolutely? Such questions, always asked by women who seek advice concerning contraceptives, testify both to their fear of involuntary motherhood and their doubt as to any and all means offered for their deliverance. Doubt as to the certainty of contraceptives arises from two sources. One is the uninformed element in the medical profession. A physician who belongs to this element may object to birth control upon general grounds, or he may repeat old-fashioned objections to cover his ignorance of contraceptives. For strange as it may seem, there is an amazing ignorance among physicians of this supremely important subject. The The uninformed objector often assumes to speak with the voice of authority, asserting that there are no thoroughly dependable contraceptives that are not injurious to the user. The other source of distrust is the experience of the woman herself. Having no place to go for scientific advice, she gathers her information from neighbors and friends. One offers this suggestion, another offers that, each urging the means that she has found successful and condemning others. All this is very confusing and extremely disturbing to the woman who, for one reason or another, is living in constant fear of pregnancy. It is not at all surprising that such a state of affairs exists. There has been so much secrecy about the whole subject, and so much dependence upon amateurish and non-professional advice, that it is almost impossible for anyone to procure reliable information or to recognize it when given. This is especially true in the United States, where there are both federal and state laws to punish those who disseminate knowledge of birth control methods. Even under present conditions, however, there is a certain amount of reliable information concerning methods of birth control. We know that there are several methods of prevention which are not only dependable, but which can be used without injury either to the man or the woman. Knowledge of what these methods are and how to apply them should be available to every married man and woman. It is safe to predict that in a very few years they will be available. Some methods are more dependable than others, just as there are some more simple of adjustment than others. Some are cheap and less durable, others are expensive and last for years. There are some which for a quarter of a century have stood the test of certainty in Holland, France, England, and the United States among the wealthier classes, as the falling birth rate among these classes indicates. And just as the reliable primitive wheelbarrow is antiquated beside the latest airplane, so as scientific investigators turn their attention more and more to this field, will the awkward, troublesome methods of the past give way to the simpler, more convenient methods of tomorrow. Although the law forbids information concerning reliable means of contraception, it is hardly likely that it can be invoked to prevent warnings against widely practiced methods which are not reliable. The employment of such methods leads not only to disappointment, but often to ill health. One of the most common practices of this kind is that of nursing one baby too long in the hope of preventing the birth of the next. The poor whites of the South and many of the foreign-born women of the United States pin their hopes to this method. Often they persist in nursing a child until it is 18 months old, almost always until they become pregnant again. Prolonged nursing hurts both child and mother, it is said. In the child it causes a tendency to brain disease, probably through disordered digestion and nutrition. In the mother it causes a strong tendency to deafness and blindness. If a child is nursed after it is 12 months old, it is generally pale, flabby, and unhealthy, often rickety, one authority points out, while the mother is usually nervous, emaciated, and hysterical. If pregnancy occurs under these conditions, the mother not only injures her own health, but that of the next child, often developing it in a weakness of constitution which it never overcomes. Moreover, prolonged nursing has been found to be unreliable as a contraceptive. We know this upon good authority. It should not be depended upon at all. The same class is the so-called safe period referred to in another chapter. For many women there is never any safe period. Others have safe periods for a number of years, only to find themselves pregnant because these periods have ceased without warning. One of the most frequent of all the mistakes made in recommending contraceptives is the advice to use an antiseptic or cold water douche. This error seems to be surprisingly persistent. I am particularly surprised to hear from women that such douches have been prescribed by physicians. Any physician who knows the rudiments of physiology and anatomy must also know that necessary and important as an antiseptic douche is as a cleanser and hygienic measure, it is assuredly not to be advised as a means of preventing conception. A woman may, and often does, become pregnant before she can make use of a douche. This is particularly likely to happen if her uterus is low. And the woman who does much walking, who stands for long hours, or who uses the sewing machine a great deal, is likely to have a low uterus. It is then much easier for the spermatozoa to enter almost directly into the womb than it would otherwise be, and the douche, no matter how soon it is used, is likely to be ineffective. The tendency of the uterus to drop under strain goes far to explain why some women who have depended upon the douche for years suddenly find themselves pregnant. Do not depend upon the douche. As a cleansing agent, it is a necessary part of every woman's toilet, but it is not a preventive. Even if the douche were dependable, the absence of sanitary convenience from households in remote districts and the difficulty of using a douche in a crowded tenement would prevent many women from making use of it. Despite the unreliability of some methods and the harmfulness of some others, there are methods which are both harmless and certain. This much the woman who is seeking means of limiting her family may be told here. In using any method whatsoever, all depends upon the care taken to use it properly. No surgeon, no matter how perfect his instruments, would expect perfect results from the simplest operation did he not exercise the greatest possible care. Common sense, good judgment, and taking pains are necessary in the use of all contraceptives. More and more perfect means of preventing conception will be developed as women insist upon them. Every woman should make it plain to her physician that she expects him to be informed upon this subject. She should refuse to accept evasive answers. An increasing demand upon physicians will inevitably result in laboratory researches and experimentation. Such investigation is indeed already beginning, and we may expect great progress in contraceptive methods in the near future. We may also expect more authoritative opinions upon preventive methods and devices. When women confidently and insistently demand them, they will have access to contraceptives which are both certain and harmless. End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12. Will birth control help the cause of labor? Labor seems instinctively to have recognized the fact that its servitude springs from numbers. Seldom, however, has it applied its knowledge logically and thoroughly. The basic principle of craft unionism is limitation of the number of workers in a given trade. This has been labor's most frequent expedient for righting its wrongs. Every unionist knows, as a matter of course, that if that number is kept small enough, his organization can compel increases of wages, steady employment, and decent working conditions. Craft unionism has succeeded in attaining these insofar as it has been able to apply this principle. It has failed insofar as it has been unable to apply it. The weakness of craft unionism is that it does not carry its principles far enough. It applies its policy of limitation of numbers only to the trade. In his home, the worker, whether he is a unionist or non-unionist, goes on producing large numbers of children to compete with him eventually in the labor market. The history of labor, says Teresa Billington Greig in the Common Sense of the Population Question, is the history of an ever unsuccessful effort upon the part of man to bring his productive ability as a worker up to his reproductive ability. It has been a losing battle all the way. The small percentage of highly skilled, organized workers lead in the struggle for better conditions. Craft unions, by limiting the number of men available for any one trade, manage to procure better pay, shorter hours, and other advantages for their members. Disaster in the form of famine, pestilence, tidal waves, earthquakes, or war sometimes limits the numbers of available workers. Then those who live in parts of the world that are not affected, or who stay at home during wars, reap a temporary advantage. These advantages, however, are quickly offset by increased prices or by competition for jobs when soldiers return from war. This form of limitation of numbers works to the advantage of labor as long as it is available, but great disasters are not constantly in operation while the workers' reproductive ability is. So in a few years they have lost what nature's destructiveness won for them. The great mass of the workers, including children and women, are unskilled and unorganized. Not only that, they are for some considerable part of the time seeking employment. They are, of course, poorly paid. Thus, through their low wages and their seeking of employment, they always come into direct competition with one another and with the skilled and organized workmen. As their families live in want and are often diseased, they create the chief social problems of the day. They bring children into a world as fast as women can bear them. With each child they increase their own misery and provide another worker to force down wages and prolong hours through competition for employment. This has been the way of labor from the beginning. It is labor's way in every country. Having discovered that there is no relief in legislation, labor organizes to limit its numbers in certain trades. Meanwhile, the women of the working class go on breeding more workers to wipe out in the future the advantages gained for the present. In Paris, for instance, the proletarian quarters of the city show a birth rate more than 3 times as high as the birth rate in the well-to-do sections. Dr. Jacques Bartillon furnishes us with statistics which prove that the birth rate in any quarter of Paris is an inverse ratio to its degree of affluence, says G. Hardy in How to Prevent Pregnancy. The rich Champs-Élysées has a birth rate a third of that of Bellerville or of the Buttes-Chaumont. From 1,000 women from the age of 15 to 50, Ménilmontant gives 116 births. The Champs-Élysées, 34 births. It is the same in Berlin. For 1,000 women from the age of 15 to that of 50, a very poor quarter gives 157 births, a rich quarter gives 47 births. And so it is all over the world. The very word proletarian, as Hardy points out, means producer of children. The children thus carelessly produced undermine the health of the mother, deepen the family's poverty, destroy the happiness of the home, and dishearten the father, All this in addition to being future competitors in the labor market. Too often their increasing number drives a mother herself into industry, where her beggarly wages tend to lower the level of those of her husband. The first sickening feature of this general situation is the high infant mortality among the children of the workers. Many children come merely to sap the strength of the mother, suffer and die, leaving to show for their coming and going only an increased burden of sorrow and debt. The lower the family income, the more of these babies die before they are a year old. A survey of infant mortality in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, by the Federal Children's Bureau gave these typical results for the year 1911. Infant mortality, father's earnings rate under $521, 197.3. $521 to $624, 193.1. $625 to $779, 163.1. $780 to $899, 168.4. $900 to $1,199, 142.3. $1,200 or over, 102. Ample, 88. These figures do not represent the total income of all families. Neither will money buy as much in 1920 as it did in 1911. 70% of the people of the United States have incomes of less than $1,000. This means that from 142 to 197 children born into such families die before they are 1 year old. The births and deaths of these children represent just so much useless burden of anguish and sorrow to the workers. Despite this high infant death rate, the workers of the United States still have more children than they can care for. There are enough of them left over to provide 3 million child laborers, who, by working for a pittance, crowd their parents out of employment and force the families deeper into poverty. When all is said and done, the workers who produce large families have themselves to blame for the hundreds of thousands of unemployed grasping for jobs. For the strike breakers, for the policemen who beat up and arrest strikers, and for the soldiers who shoot strikers down. All these come from the families of working men. Their fathers and mothers are workers for wages. Out of the loins of labor, they come into the world and compel surplus labor to betray labor that is employed. Nor is this all. When a workman of superior strength and skill, protected by his union, manages to maintain a large or moderate-sized family in a degree of comfort, there always comes a time when he must strike to preserve what he has won. If he is not beaten by unorganized workers who seek his job, he still has to face the possibility of listening to the cries of several hungry children. If the strike is a long one, these cries often down the promptings of loyalty and class interest. Often they defeat him when nothing else could. Is it any wonder that under handicaps like these, labor becomes confused and flounders? It has been offered a multitude of remedies, political reforms, wage legislation, statutory regulation of hours, and so on. It has been invited to embrace craft and industrial unionism, syndicalism, anarchism, socialism as panaceas for its liberation. Except in a few countries, it has not attained to aggressive power, but has been a tool for unscrupulous politicians. Even with the temporary advantages gained by the wiping out of millions of workers in the Great War, labor's problem remains unresolved. It has now, as always, to contend with the crop of young laborers coming into the market, and with the ever-present labor-saving machine which, instead of relieving the worker's situation, makes it all the harder for him to escape. Few laborers are needed today for a given amount of production and distribution than before the invention of these machines. Yet owing to the increase in the number of the workers, labor finds itself enslaved instead of liberated by the machine. Hitherto, says John Stuart Mill, it is questionable if all the mechanical inventions yet made have lightened the day's toil of any human being. They have enabled a greater population to live the same life of drudgery and imprisonment, an increased number of manufacturers, and others to make fortunes. That, in a few words, sums up the greatest part of labor's progress. We blame capitalism and its wasteful, brutal, industrial system for all of our social problems, but our numbers were vast and our bondage grievous before modern industry came into existence. We may curse the truss, but our subjection was accomplished before the truss had emerged from the brain of evolution. We may blame public officials and individual employers, but our burdens were crushing before these were born. We look now here, now there, for the cause of our condition, everywhere but at the right one to blame. We fight again and again for our rights, only to be conquered by our own kind, our own children, our brothers, our neighbors. Let us carry to its logical conclusion the principle of limitation which has been partially applied by labor unions. The way to get rid of labor problems, unemployment, low wages, the surplus, unwanted population, is to stop breeding. They come from our own ranks, from our own families. The way to get better wages, shorter hours, a new system for the advancement of labor, is to make labor's numbers fewer. Let us not wait for war, famine, and plague to do it. Let us cease bringing unwanted children into the world to suffer a while, add to our burdens, and die. Let us cease bringing others into the world to compete with us for a living. Let the women workers practice birth control. What are the concrete things which the worker can gain at once through birth control? First, a small family can live much better than a large one upon the wages now received. Workers could be better fed, clothed, and educated. Again, fewer children in the families of the workers would tend to check the rise in the prices of food, which are forced up as the demand increases. Within a few years, it would reduce the number of workers competing for jobs. The worker could the more easily force society to give him more of the product of his labor, or all of it. And while these things are taking place, the slums, with their disease, their moral degradation, and all their sordid accompaniments, would automatically disappear. No worker would need to live in such tenements, hence they would be modernized or torn down. At the same time, the few children that were being born to the workers would be stronger, healthier, more courageous. They would be fit human beings, not miserable victims of murderous conditions. Birth control does not propose to replace any of the idealistic movements and philosophies of the workers. It is not a substitute. It precedes. It is of itself a principle that lifts the heaviest of the burdens that afflict labor. It can and it must be the foundation upon which any permanently successful improvement in conditions is attained. It is, therefore, a necessary prelude in all effective propaganda. A few years of systematic agitation for birth control would put labor in a position to solve all its problems. Labor, organized or unorganized, must take heed of this fact. Groups and parties working for a new social order must include it in their programs. No social system, no workers' democracy, no socialist republic can operate successfully and maintain its ideals unless the practice of birth control is encouraged to a marked and efficient degree. In Spain, I saw a bullfight. It was in the great arena at Barcelona. As bull after bull went down, his magnificent, defeated strength bleeding away through wounds inflicted by his weak but skillful assailant, I thought of the world of workers and their oppressors. As each bull was sent into the arena, he was confronted by one assailant and 20 confusers. There was but one enemy for him to face, but there were 20 brilliant flags, each of a different color, to distract his attention from the man who held the weapon. No sooner was his real antagonist in danger than one of the confusers fluttered a flag before his anger-maddened eyes. With one toss of his horns he could have ripped the life from the toreador, but his confusers were always there with the flags. One after another he charged them, only to spend the force of his lungs in the empty air. He found that, as he was about to toss one of his confusers into the air, he was confronted by another flag, which he charged with equal futility. Finally, utterly bewildered and exhausted, too spiritless to meet the attack, he falls under the sword thrust of the toreador. And the sun shines in the deep blue overhead, the band plays, the 10,000 gaily clad spectators shout, while the victim is dragged out to make room for another. It is the drama of labor. It will be the drama of labor until labor finds its real enemy. That enemy is the reproductive ability of the working class, which gluts the channels of progress with the helpless and weak, and stimulates the tyrants of the world in their oppression of mankind. End of section 13.